I'm Rebecca Ann Heineman. I have traveled from the dark, dismal dungeon known as Dallas, Texas, and I want to welcome all of you to yet another Vintage Computer Federation 2025 East. I'm here to talk about the fact I am older than rocks. The problem is that I'm going to talk about audio through the ages. How it was, from a programmer's point of view, what it was like to do audio as computers evolved over time and having to deal with what people thought would pass for an audio system. So let's begin at the start. When we turned on that computer and it went hum, a nice 60-cycle hum, and then the programmers would go, oh, shoot, another tube broke. Get somebody in the back of the UNIVAC. No, not the sauna, please. Yes, go in there, replace that tube. Because after all, you know, when you are drowning in that sound of a UNIVAC running with all the fans keeping it cool, how could you can't even hear yourself think, let alone hear any sound effects. But as time went on, someone at Disney then came up with an idea of making a computer that can do tic-tac-toe using relays. So you would go up there and you just press the X or the O and the computer would go, it's thinking, and go, and then gives an answer. And then you just this, and of course you either have a tie or it wins because it's tic-tac-toe. Then later on, years go by, and then we have things like the PDP-8, which has now monitors and tubes and vacuum tubes for the TV screens. And of course, audio, why would you need that? I mean, it's just printing out the printers and so forth. Then we move forward a little bit more to something that's not really a computer, Pong. Because when Pong came out in 1971, it was all made with discrete logic. But of course, when the ball's going around, back and forth, the designers were like, it needs sound. So let's just attach a square wave generator, set it to a specific length of time, and it goes beep, bop, beep, bop, because that's all you need. But then, after that came out this computer called the Apple I. Oh my goodness, it has peripheral cards. It has no ability to save your files. It has no ability to actually modify the screen when you write to it because the chipset they use is more of a teletype than an actual display. But someone said, hey, you know what? Maybe we should be able to save and load our files. So for a peripheral card, you could plug in this card that lets you save to a cassette. Of course, to transmit to a cassette, you had to make tones. So Wozniak thinking, well, all you need for a tone is just a flip-flop, touch this one I/O port, and pray. And by tickling it at a specific frequency, you could make pulse-coded modulation sounds, which sounded, of course, what we all know as a modem, going which to a computer says, 10, go to 40, that's like, well, for us, it's like, R2D2, but somehow it understands it. So, of course, someone would say, hey, why can't I just plug that cassette out to a speaker? And lo and behold, the Apple I can actually do sound. Beep. So, of course, when the Apple II was coming around, they wisely put in a little speaker and decided, you know what? I spent so much time designing that color video and having memory mapped I/O and having memory mapped video. I'm just going to phone in the audio and just use the exact same circuit to do cassette tape to the speaker so that if you have your software touch this little port, it causes the speaker to go up. You touch it again, it goes down. Do it again, up. Do it again, down. Square wave heaven. And of course, since it's all software controlled, well, have you ever tried to run video animation and sound at the same time on an Apple II? you go mad with revelation or be on your knees begging for a new Dark Age. So many, many, many tricks had to be figured out by programmers in 1977 to 1986 when the Apple II was in its heyday, because the sound was just touch this, wait, touch that. And of course, it meant people who eventually created accelerators were like, well, I guess this computer wasn't meant to run at 4 megahertz, because if you let the computer run at 4 megahertz, all your sound is 4 times faster. So, you know, instead of having the Wolfenstein Nazis going, halt, they go, out. So with that, the accelerator manufacturers are like, please don't have sound in your product. Please don't have sound in your product. Because if you do, we'll have to slow your computer back to normal speed, 1 megahertz, for at least 500, 600 cycles, unless you touch that damn port again. And if you do, we're back to 1 megahertz. So that's why your games run at normal speed, and your sound sounds normal, despite the fact your computer is supposed to be running at 4 or 8 megahertz, depending on the accelerator you purchased. So you're like, gee, you know, my games run at the same speed as always, but when I'm running AppleWorks, it runs like a bat out of hell. I love speakers where it's totally CPU speed dependent. But Apple was not the only game in town. At this very same time when the Apple II was introduced, the Commodore PET came out. It has a monitor, keyboard, a memory map screen, and nobody really needs sound. So it's like, okay. So when I'm playing Colossal Cave and it says there's a babbling brook, everyone, use your imagination. I mean, after all, if it's good enough for Infocom to say use your imagination for graphics, it's good enough for sound too. But, however, some clever people figured out that there's a shift register in the 6821, or was it 22? Again, sometimes the details may be a little off, but I remember it was a 6822 in the Commodore PET that if you programmed it properly, you can use a port called CB2, and if you happen to wire it to a speaker, you can get some pretty clever tones out of there. At least it had a leg up over on the Apple II, because if you set these registers and then your computer crashes, it's still going beep. You know, it's a nice way to let you know your computer died, because you can hear the heartbeat going beep. Whereas the Apple II, if the Apple II dies, well, it's silent because nobody's touching that little register anymore. And of course, then it's when the sparks and stuff fly out. So Radio Shack says, you know what? We should come up with a computer too. Let's release this thing called a TRS-80. You want audio? Picky Screw you. I mean, you're already spending your, the payment of a car to buy one of our TRS-80s, and you want a sound? Of course, later on they'll get the hint, but we're talking the original TRS-80. So here it is. We're now 1977. We're going along, and people who are deaf are like, I'm not missing a thing. So then, same year, this little company you might have heard of, called Atari, came out with this video game console called the Atari 2600. It actually had a really decent sound chip with, I think it was 2 voices and 1 noise generator that you could just hit a register, and it could do all different waveforms, square wave, sine wave, all these stuff. And then just by little software programming once per frame, which is once every 1/6 of a second, you could play some really nice music. There's only one problem, though, is that whoever designed the video chip on there was obviously phoning it in, because there was this term called racing the beam, and if you've ever programmed the Atari 2600, you will know what I mean. Oh, anybody here of convulsing and having your PTSD triggered? Ah, we found an Atari 2600 programmer right here. Yeah. Therapy, lots of therapy.
Already doing it.
Yeah, at least you know the game runs at 60 frames per second, because if it doesn't, your game ain't shipping. But then, this other company, a year later, says, you know what, all you guys, screw you. I'm making the Intellivision with a sound chip which actually has more voices than the Atari, but with a CPU that's so slow that heaven help you to try to make use of it. So even though it has better graphics, the music and sound are about Atari 2600 quality. But at least both consoles, the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision, were now in an arms race. Let's see who, through software, programming trickery, or a massive drug session, or being drunk all night, says, I've got an epiphany, comes out with something new. And of course, somewhere along the line, Intellivision says, you know what? Voice. If you give us more money, we can plug in this voice box, which will then just say 2 or 3 words in your entire cartridge, because they forgot one thing. Yeah, it has voice, but the amount of memory it takes to actually play that voice is kind of hard to fit in an 8K cartridge. Yeah, we're talking 1978 here. 8K is like, that's half my memory on my Apple II, because Apple IIs in 1977 were a glorious 16K. I mean, that's enough memory to put in, you know, an operating system and 4K for basic. So, yes, someone excuse me? Oh, well, next comes the Atari 400, in which really it's the basic design of the 2600, except instead of me racing the beam, they have another chip doing that with display lists, beautiful graphics, and an even better sound chip. So now we're starting to hear music like the theme from Mule. Because who doesn't remember starting up Mule and hearing that catchy tune going like, I could screw the game, I'm just going to sit and listen to this. So, 2 years later, Commodore goes like, Atari, we've been working on this for a couple of years. We're going to get back at you. After all, gauntlet's been thrown. Comes out the Atari 400, oh, sorry, take it back. The Commodore VIC-20, the birth of the SID. And of course, everyone here loves the SID chip because in time, with the Commodore 64, it has things like attack, decay, sustain, release in hardware. It has all these different sound modules, and this gave birth to what we now know as the tracker scene on the Commodore 64. There's so many games on the Commodore 64 in which the music soundtrack is just beautifully orchestrated. Forget the word. But it just sounds so much better as time goes on. And then IBM says, you know what? I'm going to come out with a new PC. I'm going to come out with something that I just bought all the chips from a parts catalog because I'm phoning it in. Oh, sound? Sure, everybody needs that Control-G beep. So we'll just attach a timer, put it to your sound chip. That's good enough. So, the guys at Apple goes like, you're still better than us. But however, it once again made people writing games on the IBM PC want to learn how to, the beauties of alcohol as they're trying to write software that would make any sort of tones on the IBM PC that actually sounds better than, beep, boop. So, of course, there was this company called Creative Labs, as well as others, Gravis, Disney Sound Source, and so forth, that all decided to not talk to each other and come up with different solutions on how to put sounds on the IBM PC. Some, brilliant. Others were, whoever supplied you that weed, I'm going to report them right now to the cops. But because the fact that you had to buy a peripheral to be able to actually get any decent sound on the PC kind of means that really, technically, the PC is still left behind with the beeps, bops, boops. I mean, it really sucks. But then, after the PC came out, was the Commodore 64, which was, hey, VIC-20, hold my beer. And the SID that we now know was born. And with the SID, that chip allowed us to have all those voices, the fact that it had things that musicians wanted. So obviously the people who came up with the SID knew what music needed, because one of the first things they teach you when you are learning how to create sound from a technical standpoint is the 12th root of 2, and that a sound envelope is attack, decay, sustain, release, because that is what is needed for a musical instrument. And every single sound chip before the C64 and some of the 20 was you're on your own. You know, fake it till you make it. Because like with the Apple II and the Atari, even the Atari 2600, all the attack, decay, sustain, release had to be done in software. But here you had a chip that did it in hardware. And with that, you know, thousands and thousands of songs have been composed on the, with the SID chip. And here it is, 2025, and people are like 8-Bit Weapon and Computer Her are making new music on albums using exclusively SID chips. Now that's a standard of longevity. Well, let's go back to the console market. 1983, actually take it back, 1982, Coleco said, you know what, we're maybe late to the party, but we're going to come out with a ColecoVision. And the ColecoVision had a sound chip straight from an arcade game, because as I know from my from someone who I was married to who worked at Coleco, she said, yeah, they phoned it in. The entire design of that machine was something that they put together, said, hey, you know, it shouldn't be that hard to put together a video game console, so here's a off-the-shelf TI video chip, here's some memory, and since cartridges on the Atari 2600 were only 2K and 4K, and they're very cheap to make, there should be no problem to make a video game console that we can make cartridges that require only 4K on a modern computer like a Commodore 64 level hardware. They found out the hard way that you need at least 16K for a ROM in order to do any kind of game. But they at least used a AY3910, may need to be correction on it, correct? SN7649. Okay, SN76489. It was a very decent sound chip, still not on par with the SID, but it allowed the ColecoVision to have sounds that just blew away what was on the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision, and a year later the entire market crashed and everybody is thrown into a crater and buried never and forgotten forever. Well, after that video game crash, Commodore says, you know what, we're going to come up with a computer that makes everybody want to just go, It's going to be your friend, your Amiga. And this time, once again, they listened to programmers who do actual audio. Now, as what was said in the Ensonic group, the people designing the Amiga realized that computers were getting faster and faster. The Amiga had a blitter, so that takes care of the speed of drawing for the video. But for audio, since the 68,000 was relatively fast and it had a multiply instruction, you could do most of the common math to do audio processing. So why not just use 4 DMA registers to 4 digital audio converters, 2 for the left, 2 for the right, speaker that is, and play your music. It took until 1985 for a computer to come standard with stereo. Yeah, it took a while, but the very fact, oh my God, what's in the left ear is actually different from what's in the right ear? What a concept. And the fact that this was all running but DMA control, again, the audio can run with minimal processing from the computer, especially if your waveforms already have attack, decay, sustain, release encoded in them. And another thing this chip, the Amiga brought into was digital audio, in which all of the audio tracks were samples from actual musical instruments or people's voices, or in some rare cases, they actually just tracks from real music from musicians and so forth, and just played that and mixed it in such a way that they can extend it for a full 3-minute song despite the memory limitations. So, this little company named Apple, who for the last 9 years has been the butt of every single joke when it comes to audio. Yes, there was the Mockingbird, but so few people came out with it. And then there was this thing called the Apple IIc, which, you know what, you could have improved the audio, but nope, nope. We'll still curse you with that one little bit. You know, touch this, click, touch this, click. But for some reason, the people at Apple in 1986 said, you know what, we are so tired of being the laughingstock of the entire video game computer industry. Let's go to a company called Ensonic, formed by former Commodore people, you know, the people who helped make the Amiga and the C64, and say, what you got? And they said, let's show you. And they said, ooh, shiny. So they went ahead and put in a full-fledged synthesizer. It's like me going around through life on a scooter where I just push and the wheels are broken and sometimes they turn into squares because, you know, they hate me. And then someone says, oh, by the way, here's the keys to a Ferrari. That's your new upgrade. And it's like, whoa, 32 voices, 64K of dedicated audio memory. It reads memory at 1 megahertz samples per second. Shared, of course, among 32 samples, 32 voices. It has the ability to do stereo. Note my choice of words. It has the, with the system design, I could technically do 32 voices if they're just mono voices, or I can do 16 voices if they're polyphonic, because I can actually chain 2 voices together to modify them, so one voice could be an attack, decay, sustain, release envelope, and the other voice is the actual sample. And by doing that, I can have the hardware handle that for me. So I'm able to make beautiful music like I did with the soundtrack of Bard's Tale 3, or so 1 and 2 for the Apple IIgs, Task Times in Tone Town, Out of This World, all on the 2GS, with music that rivals even modern machines today. Of course, Apple forgot, one little thing is that, they didn't put the equivalent of a gas cover on my Ferrari, because while the chip the Ensonic used for the Apple IIgs was stereo capable, someone forgot to add that line. So the Apple IIgs stock was a mono audio machine. Yeah, it was making beautiful music out of one speaker. There was a cheap hardware mod that you can buy to put into 2GS to give you stereo, but it's like almost nailed the bullseye. And then, of course, within months after the 2GS came out and it was eclipsing the Macintosh sales by a lot, Steve Jobs decided that we must destroy this. And then, of course, what didn't help was that piece of actual trivia here. When Apple first was incorporated, there was a company known by this little-known band called the Beatles. And their record label was Apple Records. So they went into an agreement saying, as long as Apple Computer doesn't do music, Apple Records will never make computers. The 2GS, the Beatles listened to this thing and saying, you're making music. Don't lie to me. This thing is a freaking synthesizer. Let's go to court. So after, the usual lawyers getting really fat on lots of fees, they settled and put that aside. But it gives you an idea that the 2GS's sound capabilities was so good that it pissed off the Beatles. So, now that we've gone through all the computers of the retro age, let's go now to the fact that by 1986, CPUs were starting to get faster and faster. Now, back then, they were still only 20 megahertz, 30 megahertz on your PC, because the PC's only been around for 5 years. So, as people started really migrating to the PC, and all the other companies that were making computers and stuff were kind of going by the wayside, that's when we started seeing the audio cards I mentioned before for the PC, the Gravis Ultrasound, the Disney Sound Source, and the Sound Blaster Live. But because the CPUs were still really not that fast, they were fast, but not fast enough to be able to, let's say, play Wing Commander and process all the audio at the same time without some degradation of quality. That's when companies started putting a lot of the smarts into their audio cards, such as like EAX for Creative Labs. And then, of course, later on, all the other brands are putting a lot of CPU power inside of their boards, such as like onboard audio memory, onboard. I remember there was a time between 1987 to around 1994, writing code for audio cards was a pain in the butt because you had to first query what system, do you have memory? Do you have DMA? Do you have this? Do you have that? In some cases, I had to run benchmarks before the game ran to see which one actually worked because the flags that Direct Sound told me lied. But in all cases, the sound was starting to get better and better. And then came out this brand new invention which actually changed things to what it is today. The CD-ROM. The CD-ROM, the ability to put digital data on a little disk, granted laser discs had already been around beforehand, but the idea that you can have a dedicated disk with 660 glorious meg of space that can play about an hour's worth of audio at 44 kilohertz, 16-bit audio. All you do is just read and just throw it out the DAC and that's it. No processing, no stuff, no nothing, just do that. Well, of course, all the audio cards up to this time, which I hadn't mentioned, is 8-bit. They do all their processing, but in the end, it comes out as 8-bit data. But now you're listening to music on a CD, it's like 16-bit. So within months of the CD-ROM coming out, almost every single audio card that were being introduced since then was now 16-bit capable. And everybody writing games, such as myself, said, oh, well, now we're going to have to start doing 16-bit samples. But here's the fun part. Once you get to 48 kilohertz base frequency, 16-bit samples, you are pretty much at the range of human hearing. Any higher frequencies or higher data rates or higher bit rates, unless you're someone who's got exceptional hearing, you can't tell them apart. So now we're starting to plateau, which then led to what I would consider the standardization of audio, and that started around the year 2000. And that is, in the year 2000, the average computer ran about 250 to 700 megahertz, somewhere in that range. But they were rapidly getting faster and faster. It was like every year the computer was getting double the speed or something like that. So it got to the point where CPUs were so fast that all the processing to do audio, such as stereo effects, echo effects, like here, you could hear this echo in this room. Well, I can simulate that in software on a modern PC with very little CPU interference, so that sound hardware started going backwards. They found that EX is not needed. You don't need all this fancy hardware. You don't need memory on your audio cards. You don't need anything. So now, when you buy your IBM PC compatible, the audio hardware in there is just literally nothing more than 2 DACs, one for the left and one for the right channel, and a DMA channel for both of them. Or, in some cases, some extra hardware to maybe do the Dolby 7.1 or 5.1 mixing. But that's pretty much it. Because they expect you now that your CPUs are running so fast that you can exactly do every piece of mixing that you want, how you want it, with your CPU. So why bother spending money on putting hardware on your computer that could do all that for you, when in many cases the CPU can do it faster and you already have it. So technically cheaper. So now when you watch a video game of pretty much every single console for the past 10, actually since the year 2000, all audio is just orchestral music recorded from a live orchestra, synthesized mod music that's just mixed on the fly, but all of it is almost 100% software generated. But it is now indistinguishable in some cases from the real thing. And that has occurred really from the tics of the 1970s to the CD-ROM era of the 2000s. To me, one thing it's a little, trying to find the best words to say it, the thing that's good for me is that technology when it comes to audio generation has actually stopped about 10 years ago. Because for the last 10 years, I haven't seen anybody come out with a PC sound card unless it's literally you're hooking it up to a synthesizer for a rock band, an actual rock band, not the game. But everything's now just done with direct sound. In fact, direct sound hasn't changed since 2000. See, when was direct sound 8 introduced? Something like around 1990. It was 1995 because I know it was in Windows 95. But I think it was around maybe 2000 was when DirectX 8. Now they now call it X Audio and so forth. But when you really look at it, it's just a different API for doing the same thing. So the only thing happening now with audio is, of course, people are trying to generate with AI, which I have my own problems with that because AI has to be trained on somebody else's work, and basically you're selling somebody else's stolen work. But that's my opinion. But today it's one where that since now audio has reached essentially, in my opinion, its peak, in which when you listen to music on PC, it basically you're just playing a recording. And you really can't get much better than that. And with you're playing a video game, they can actually look at the geometry of the world to echo the sounds like you're stepping in water. Now when your footsteps, you actually hear the water. You can hear the echoes of the world. That's all done in software. But it is a long way coming from the times when sound wasn't even part of the spec of building a computer to now the computers have gotten so powerful that it's now just an afterthought. But that's basically been the majority of my talk, even though it's only been 33 minutes. So I'm open to questions right now. Anybody have a question? Okay.
So I know that you have experience with audio on video game systems like the Nintendo and Super Nintendo.
Yes.
Do you feel the audio evolution on consoles to the same singularity as PCs is the same trajectory, or does it seem a little different enough to talk about?
The thing, though, is that it's a parallel trajectory. To give you an idea, after the ColecoVision, there was a video game crash. Then Nintendo came out with their Nintendo 8-bit Famicom. The thing is that the Nintendo 8-bit Famicom used very similar hardware for audio as the ColecoVision. So it really wasn't much better than the ColecoVision. But then when the Super Nintendo came out, that was a leap forward almost to the level of the 2GS, in which on the Super Nintendo, they actually had a separate CPU running in its own memory that even had audio decompression in hardware and played 16-bit audio. And this was, when was the year for the Super Nintendo? It was like our 1991, something like that, which already is 5 years after the 2GS. So the 2GS already predated it. But the difference that they did was that they took what was the equivalent of 2GS Ensonic hardware. It was a different design, it's not the same chip, but they added its own CPU to do the work so the main Super Nintendo didn't have to. But then, shortly thereafter, the Xbox, the PlayStation, and later on the Nintendo 64 all realized that the CPUs in those consoles were fast enough that, again, their hardware also degraded so that they were back to just digital audio converters and all the sound was done with audio mixing. So in many cases, because the fact that with the consoles, they had all control over the hardware, which is the CPU speed, the types of things, and cost. Because don't forget, with a console, cost is everything. And hence, if they could just get away with 2 digital analog converters, one for left, one for right, and maybe a DMA channel, in some cases maybe not, they would. And so, like today, the Xbox One is using almost identical audio hardware to most modern PCs. So, which is just 2 DMA channels, 2 audio converters, and maybe a little extra for the Dolby, and that's it. Everything else is mixed in software. So hence, yeah, while the consoles did have their own trajectory, it actually was following along with the PCs until everybody caught up, and now we've reached essentially the peak. Next question? Good.
Kind of pedaling back. What was going on during that little period with like the Sega CD? How did that whole thing function?
The Sega CD used an, I think it was either an AY or a National Instruments chip, but basically it's a chip very similar to like the ColecoVision. So all the sound effects are done with. But however, the Sega CD was interesting because the bus of the Sega CD was so slow that you couldn't, let's say, read the audio data, put it into the Sega, and then process it through the audio port. What they did was the equivalent of, here's your CD player, press play. And then the CD and its hardware would just send its output directly to the speaker and spit it out. So the CPU itself didn't do anything. An example is one of the reasons why I kind of skipped the Mac, was that when I was doing Macintosh games, music was done exactly that way, where you literally send a command to the CD player, play an audio track, we called it Red Book audio. So you had your game on a CD, the first track was the game, but the second, third, fourth was actual CD audio tracks that you could just put to a CD player and play them. So to play the music, like Aliens vs. Predator, I just simply said, okay, hit track 3, press play. And then I would just do the game. No music was done in the game at all because I'm just playing the CD player. Sega CD, that's how I did it. Also, just so you know, the Jaguar CD was the same thing. Another question, please. Yes.
Did you do any PS3 dev?
PS3 dev? Yes, I did.
So you're probably one of the first game devs to ever, at least in the U.S., to ever touch an ARM because of all of your 3DO stuff.
The PS3 is not ARM.
So
it was PowerPC.
So the sound hardware in the PS3 is ARM. And I was wondering if there's any, you've got the Cell CPU in the PS3 for CPU,
yeah.
But my question was, did you have any, did they just throw you dev kit stuff, or did you touch any of the ARM stuff in the PS3 doing
PS3,
sound specifically?
I never needed to push anything to the ARM because all the ARM did was just control the DMA registers, and I mixed the sound using the cell and sent it off to the ARM that way.
So that was already just there for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you may want to bring up the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 didn't have a CPU that was fast enough to do really complicated audio as the video games would want to require. Now, the audio hardware on the PlayStation 2 is a PS1.
Yeah.
Those of you who don't know it, if you own a PS2, in your PS2 is a PlayStation 1 chipset. And that is how they got PlayStation 1 emulation. But then Sony said, wait a minute, the PlayStation 1 has audio hardware. Why don't we just simply put some code in there, PS1 code, into that thing? Then you send commands to it from the PS2, kind of like the equivalent of press play, except since you're writing your own audio driver, why not just put, let's say, a mod player or something and play your sound effects and so forth. And that's like the one and only time, well, other than the Super Nintendo, because both the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation 2 were the only 2 consoles that I'm aware of, and people can correct me, in which the audio subsystem was its own CPU, memory, program, and all you did was communicate with it by just sending commands through a port.
I'll offer you that correction. The Sega Genesis contains an entire Sega Master System and works in basically the same way. A lot of people would throw sound processing at the Z80 for the Sega Master System and use its PSG either for sound
So
effects
they weren't
or
the first to do it.
something like that.
But, you know, it's one of the ways of saying, hey, let's save money. Let's not put anything new in sound because what we had before was good enough, which goes back to the, you know, why sound technology in many ways, as far as hardware is concerned, has kind of just disappeared. We have a question over there, gentleman with the hat? Oh, another one? Okay. We'll get to you soon.
What about audio on the Macintosh before the advent of CD-ROM?
All they did was they had a single, originally for the Lisa and then the Mac. Well, the Lisa was just polling and shoving data to make a beep, and that's all it did. So because it was polling, you couldn't really have it run simultaneously because you had to, like the Apple II, stop what you're doing, make the sound, go back to what you're doing. But with the Mac, they actually tied a DMA channel to it, but the software still did some processing. But for the Mac, all they really did was just have a sampled sound of the bong when it starts up. But that's the complete extent to it. And of course, with the Mac, their idea was that the Mac was so fast and powerful that why bother putting money into actual sound hardware when the CPU can handle it? When 2 years later, the Apple II engineers saying, screw that, let's put an Ensonic in there.
Follow-up question. What is the Apple sound chip, though?
The Apple sound chip is the DMA registers and 2 DACs.
Okay.
That's all that's in there.
All right.
Yeah, it's a piece of hardware that they designed that has the 2 DMA registers, the DACs. I think it had several other DMA registers that do some little minor tricks, but it really didn't do much more than that.
I was wondering, did you ever have to apply any consideration for the limitations of the physical output, the speakers that would be used in a particular console, or especially for things where people might be using their own particular outputs? Did you ever need to place any consideration on how would this sound out of something non-standard, out of whatever this is going to be playing through?
Okay, what you're asking is, did people take into account the physics of the speaker when it came to the sound output? The quality of the speaker. Okay, the thing though is that when it comes to a high-end speaker, you can't fool them. They're actually, have such a responsiveness that even CD audio, you can hear the differences in the sound pitch, which is why people go to vinyl. Because vinyl is totally analog, so a high-end speaker it can't be fooled because there's nothing to fool it with. Whereas with digital audio, there is what we call quantization going on. And high-end speakers can rat it out. Now, I will share with you, we used tricks on the Apple II because the Apple II used the old little 2-inch speaker, which was crappy. And we realized that when you ticked that address to cause the speaker to move up, it was a physical amount of time, and we could actually outrun the speaker. So we would then wait, we'd turn it on, the speaker would start moving up, but then I would tick it to make it go back down. But of course, it doesn't go down immediately. It slows down. Then it starts moving down, click it again, move up, click it down. And then by using the physics of the speaker, I was able to create MFM sound effects, like in the games Bard's Tale 3 for the Apple II, in which I actually had digital sound, in which I had sampled sounds of the priest going, Dona eis requiem. And that sound was because I analyzed how the speaker worked and figured out how to use that to my advantage. So while if you play that sound effect on an Apple II, not the 2GS, the 2GS is a perfect sound, but on the Apple II, if you played it on, let's say, some Von Karman speakers, it would be very tinny and had massive quantization. But if you played it on a 2-inch speaker, it's like, it's digital audio. And that's how I was able to do that, because I was taking advantage that the speakers were a piece of crap. You had a question over here. Just a minute, she'll be there, and they'll be there in just a minute. There we go. Hit me.
How similar were the audio, I guess, chips and DACs and stuff from PCM audio recording from like the 70s and like prior to a lot of this stuff happening? Was that like its own separate thing and then they converged later on, or was the technology developed for like recording studios and making CDs when they first were, made, and digital master tapes for recording music and stuff before CDs were for the general public? Was that equipment then evolving into the stuff we use for like PC and game sound, or is that like its own thing and they are kind of related to each other?
So you're asking what the quality of the hardware, the designs of the hardware done in, let's say, the music industry had bleed through to the PC industry?
Like, were there very similar chips found in like a PCM recorder in a audio studio in the late 70s to chips you'd find in a computer in the 80s?
Well, considering that the Ensonic ESQ1 had the same chip on a 2GS, the answer is yes.
Okay.
It is literally the same chip. The only difference is that on the Ensonic keyboard that they sold for musicians had 128K of memory, it had stereo, and a much better audio filtering systems. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, it's the same chip. And also, as you may have heard in the previous talk here with Ensonic, is that they first started in the computer world because their people from Ensonic came from Commodore, and they're the ones who designed the SID. And they went into music, and then they went back into computers again, so forth. So when it comes to bleed through and technology, yes, that happens all the time, because audio in the musician field and audio in the computer field, it's the same audio. Now, granted, things like the Yamaha keyboards and so forth, well, Yamaha made several of the chipsets that we use in our consoles, like the Yamaha 3910. Was it 3910? Okay, maybe it was. But I know Yamaha made a series of audio chips that were used in personal computers. I know the Mockingbird was using Yamaha chips. And of course, those chips were stolen straight from Yamaha's own designs on their own synthesizers.
That's more for like synth and FM synth, like you just said. But what about like PCM audio? In my mind, I'm thinking of a specific video where there was a box that you'd put in between a audio source and a VCR to be able to record analog audio as digital audio in a video signal. Obviously, there's a bunch of math happening in there, and I was wondering if those specific chips, because that's doing PCM audio 10, 15 years before computers could ever really touch that kind of stuff.
Well, PCM, audio recording for a computer was always PCM. Because you basically take an analog signal and somehow convert it into a digital value. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, if you're going to direct to cassette tape or vinyl, then you're just taking the analog signal and recording it analogly onto the medium. But with computers, there is no analog medium. I mean, technically floppy disks are, but you're still recording digital data on it. Yeah. And same goes with cassettes. You're hearing that sound on there. It's definitely not your favorite country song. But if you take that digital data, recompose it back to the pulse code modulation data, and play it out digitally, you get your song back.
Moving between analog and pulse code modulation, is that just a DAC in there and it's like a pretty solid state feed in digital, get out analog, feed in analog, get out digital? Or?
Well, essentially it's a sampling chip. What it does, modern technology, is that you get the analog signal, figure out what the voltage is. They have several samplers. They average them between together, put some filtering in there, make sure it's stable. That then generates a digital data. It then samples this at exactly 48 kilohertz, and then that generates your data. Now, of course, granted, there's always some filtering software, filtering hardware to get rid of the noise, because there's always ambient noise. So it's like, you may be hearing my voice right now, but in this room, there's a hum coming from these fluorescent lights. There's people walking around talking in the other room. While you and I may be able to filter it out, a computer can hear that clearly. And that's why you need the filtering in order to get rid of all those little extra noises, and that's probably what you're thinking of when it comes to the hardware. With computers, up until recently, it's more like, again, the last 10 years, they kind of phoned it in when it came to microphones. So when you did a microphone or audio recording using, let's say, a Commodore 64 or an Apple II or even a Macintosh, it really depended on what the quality is of the recording mic you had to get the filtering in the hardware, but then the sampler they had in those computers, especially for like the laptops and the Macintosh laptops, which had a built-in mic, they don't even have multiples of samplers. They just take whatever the audio is, just grab it, whatever the number pops up, close enough, use that. Oh. Which is why, early computers, when you listened to a video chat, video call, or audio, just an audio telephone call on a computer, it was always had some noise because the analog to digital converter was a cheap one. Now, of course, today, what we usually do, like I'm going to use my own example, I have a Blue microphone, which is a high-end audio podcast recording microphone. It has its own audio to digital DAC inside of it, plus all the hardware, blah, blah, blah. It's connected to my PC through the USB port. So all the PC gets is pure digital data. It goes like, oh, you're just sending me digital data. I'm good here. I don't know where it came from, but the Blue microphone did all the work. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what's going on today, especially like a really good modern microphone for computers.
All right, that's all the time we have for questions. Give it up for Audio Through the Ages.